Hi everyone, welcome back to the second installment of Klesis Weekly. For those of you who haven't met me yet, my name is Godwin Law. I'm one of the alumni mentors for Klesis Christian Fellowship, which is a Christian fellowship at Berkeley. And this is also the group that's hosting tonight's talk. So we started these weekly talks with the hope of providing some Christian perspectives in a time where I think many of us are left feeling disoriented or confused. Because we actually believe that our faith has so much to say about our current crisis. We hope that these talks can offer some clarity as we try to navigate through these important topics together. So last week, if you were with us, I gave a talk with Sean on the intellectual case for the resurrection. And if you missed it, we'll include a link to the recording in the description, or in the chat window, I mean. But for tonight, I will actually not be the one giving the talk. Instead, we're going to hear from Nathan, who is another Klesis alumni mentor and my coworker, actually. And also from Michael, who's a freshman at Cal majoring in math. And the topic that they'll be speaking on today is moral objectivity, whether it's fact or fiction. So is there such a thing as moral absolutes? And if so, where would they come from? But before we begin, I just want to recommend putting Zoom into speaker view by clicking on view options in the screen sharing bar and selecting fit to window. So that way you'll be able to see the slides and the speaker next to each other. But okay, with all that out of the way, I'm now going to hand things over to Nathan and Michael.
Hey guys, we're so happy that y'all can join us today. We're super excited to talk about this topic of morality and of good and evil. But before we begin, we just wanted to do a little bit of an introduction of ourselves. So like Godwin said, my name is Nathan, and I'm a Cal alum. I graduated in business a few years ago, and now I'm working as a product marketer at Salesforce. And actually, when I first met Christians as an atheist when I was 18, when I was a freshman in college, this moral argument was one that really bothered me, actually. In an atheistic worldview, I had just about zero explanation for the objective morality that I believed in as well. My views were completely contradictory and incompatible. And so this topic was actually one of the things that jump-started my own spiritual journey, trying to find out where this whole morality thing even came from.
Hello, I'm Michael. I'm a Cal freshman studying math and physics. And for me, my spiritual journey began my junior year in high school, when times were tough competing in physics and viola and ultimate frisbee. That summer, I was going through a bit of an existential crisis, trying to figure out the purpose of my, at the time, seemingly worthless life and morals. And in order to combat it, I read existential and atheist philosophers like Nietzsche, Camus, and Russell. One key implication of their work was that morals were relative, which was the one piece of their flow which the more I read just didn't fit right with me. That's why today, Nathan and I will be sharing some of our flow.
Yeah, so we're going to start today with a little bit of a quiz to get our brains warmed up to the topic of morality. And so this is a little bit of a 3 truths and 1 lie. One of these headlines is one that I made up, and the other 3 are headlines that I actually pulled from the news. So I'll go ahead and give you guys a minute to input your responses. You're going to text Klesis Weekly 111 to 37607, and then put A, B, C, or D as your response. Or you can go to pollev.com/KleisisWeekly111. Again, there is 3 truths and 1 lie, and you're going to be guessing which one is the lie. So I'll give you guys a minute for that. Good. Go ahead to get some answers in. All right, I'm gonna close in the poll in about 15 seconds. So it looks like C and D are tied for the lie. So actually the right answer is C. That did not happen. The Tennessee woman did not burn down the toilet paper sculpture, inciting rage from the town. But All the other ones, they're true. So you're probably seeing a lot of these headlines on the news about people committing, morally dubious acts, from violence to greediness to abuse. It seems like this coronavirus thing, it's really bringing out the worst in the world. And it got me thinking, like, why do we get so mad or disappointed at all of this? And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to put on this short talk. It's because we're making so many moral judgments and decisions in this season. And I thought it would be a good thought exercise to think about where all of these are coming from. And so that brings us, in that vein, why does it matter that we see where our moral beliefs and judgments are even coming from? Maybe you were brought to this talk by a friend, or you saw something on social media, but I think the subject of morality is probably one of the most important subjects that really nobody talks about. It's the undercurrent of so much. So there's two reasons I'm going to discuss here. I think the practical implications are pretty clear. If we understand where our morality is coming from, or even what true morality is, then we can better live lives of virtue and then make decisions that are in line with good. It's easy to float through life without thinking about what is good and what is evil. And of course, we need to know what is good if we want to live our lives aligned to it. And then I think there's a philosophical angle. Morality, I think, is one of the hints that we can pull from to understand deep spiritual and philosophical truths. Like we shared, this is one of the launch points for our own spiritual journeys, Michael and I's. And I really don't think it's too far to say that I can start yours as well.
Yeah, so now we'll just start with a basic definition of what morality exactly is. Today's definition is sponsored by the Oxford Dictionary of English. It describes morality as the principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong, or good and bad behavior. Today, we're going to look at the underlying beliefs and systems behind our conception of morality and ethics. The specific question that we're going to tackle today is who or what determines morality? If it's self or society, then this would fall into the category of moral thinking that we call moral relativism. In this view, morality is determined person to person or culture to culture. It is measured relative to varying standards. My morality might be different than your morality, for example. You may think it's okay to hoard toilet paper and I don't, but there's no real true statement. And additionally, it will be different from culture to culture. In China, for instance, it may be okay to do this, but in another culture, it's not. But again, there's no truth. If it's something more, and we'll talk about what that something more might be later, then it would be called moral objectivism. This morality is determined by something outside of people, so it is universal across all people at all times. We'll go deeper into each one of these. But first, we wanted to give a little background on moral relativism. Oddly enough, relativism has only been relevant philosophically for the last 100 years. While ancient Chinese philosophers theorized basic forms of it, and Greek sophist Protagoras famously got destroyed by Plato for believing in it, objectivism has been prima facie, meaning immediately obvious upon inspection, for almost all of human history. All of a sudden, however, relativism blows up in the 20th century. In 1947, the American Anthropology Association declared that morals can only be measured relative to a given cultural standard. An exploration of relativism became massively relevant in philosophic academia and widely promoted within certain political ideologies. In fact, a poll reveals that 73% of young adults now believe in moral relativism. It went from a barely acknowledged, often mocked theory to now the most popular view of morality. In the next few slides, we'll explore some common forms of relativism, why they're appealing, but also some of their weaknesses. Before we begin, let's note that we could talk for hours about all the caveats, technical terms, arguments, and counter-arguments for and against relativism. But since we don't have that kind of time, we'll just go over some of the basic ones. So let's go ahead and dive into our first interpretation of morality. Perhaps individuals determine morality. In this view, morality is determined by individuals. By definition, then, it cannot be anything more than personal preference. Here's an analogy. We can think of morality, by this definition, similar to the way people differ in preferences for where they would fish. Some like to fish in the ocean, some in lakes, some in streams. There's no objective best, so people ought just to do what they most enjoy. And the heart behind this view is one of tolerance. Here are some quotes from famous authors that talk a little bit about this view. For example, Paul Coelho, a famous writer of fiction, says, open quote, "In order to have faith in his own path, he does not need to prove that someone else's path is wrong," end quote. If there's no true morality, then there's no need to judge other people for their moral beliefs, just like since there's no objective truth of the best place to fish. You need not judge people for doing something different. But while this view can be tempting because of the social implications, it can also be dangerous. Take Ted Bundy, for example, one of the most monstrous men of all time. Ted Bundy, over the course of 4 years, raped and killed 30 women, and probably more. He took this view to its logical conclusion. He says, open quote, "Then I learned that all moral judgments are value judgments. The value judgments are subjective, and that none can be proved to be either right or wrong. Let me assure you that there's absolutely no comparison the pleasure I might take in eating ham and the pleasure I take in raping and murdering women," end quote. If moral choices are really entirely up to the individual, then we have no right to condemn such a man. Even the statement that I made at the beginning, that he was monstrous, would be incorrect. He was just following his own morality. And it's not just him either. We would have no grounds on which to condemn any of these actions that are in the news. The hoarding, ignorance of social distancing, the violence, the abuse. We would be resigned to say that we don't like it, that it makes us uncomfortable. That's the problem. We can never say that it's evil or wrong, or that these people can be held culpable for their actions. But when we take a look at reality, morals are more important than just preferences. Here's another analogy. If someone walked up to me and told me that they prefer apples over oranges, I would humbly say, good for you. Being allergic to apples, I could never imagine agreeing with his or her bizarre tastes. But there's nothing particularly important about our differing preferences. On the other hand, if someone told me that they preferred to murder someone they disliked over their limiting moral conscience that told them otherwise, I would probably think they were a psychopath and humbly refer them to a therapist. Condemning evil takes more than just asserting that it personally displeases one of us. Furthermore, we certainly wouldn't believe that the only thing wrong with murder was that it makes us personally unhappy. It seems like the nature of morality is not compatible with just personal preference. It begs the question, what if morality is about more than just personal preference?
So in light of that, we're going to do another quick poll, and this will make more sense later. But which one of these categories is closest to you to a moral outrage? Meaning that if someone were to disagree with you on this issue, then you would have a kind of righteous indignation at them. So go ahead and submit your responses just like last time. I'll give you about a minute to do so. Close that poll. It looks like, oh, Stanford versus Berkeley making a late move there and taking first place. So, like, no matter how passionate you are about each one of these issues, and as crazy as it is to think that Stanford is better than Berkeley, you know, we can understand that these are just personal preferences and they're not actually moral problems like punching your mom over her hiding toilet paper. So if we can see, you know, what Michael talked about, that morality based on individual preferences doesn't work, let's go ahead and peel back a layer of this onion, this graph here, and zoom out a little bit and see if looking at morality from society's point of view works. So in this view, society comes up with a set of standards that determines what is right and what is wrong. And in this case, we'd say that our morality then is the morality of 21st century America, that there's no morality outside of that. But for instance, you know, say that there's a 6th century Pakistani, and he would have completely different set of moral standards that are no more or less right or true than our standards today. I could not say what they were doing is wrong, just that we wouldn't do that, whatever they're doing, in 21st century America. An analogy for this, it's kind of how it makes moral choices kind of like how we drive in different countries. In the UK, or maybe if you're from Hong Kong, they drive on the left. Here in America, we drive on the right. Neither is better than the other, but it's simply different. And so if you have this view, you believe the same thing about morality, that some cultures just do different things, but it would be kind of ridiculous to have an impassioned argument about which one is better, because there's no true better. And this view does pretty well for the most part. We can say Ted Bundy, that guy was completely out of line with what society views as acceptable, so he deserves punishment. You know, same with these folks, you know, the Kentucky doctor who strangles the girl, Florida man who steals all this toilet paper, we can condemn their actions too. But the fact that throws a little bit of a monkey wrench in this view is that society accepts morally bankrupt institutions and customs all the time. In fact, history shows that societies and cultures can be even more wrong than individuals. Like, I think you can even think of some of the socially acceptable ways that our 21st century American society is pretty messed up. But for sake of example, we're going to take a look at world history, a little walk down memory lane. So for America, since the founding of our country up to a little bit before 1863, most of the country believed that it was acceptable to own another human being, and therefore being able to treat them like an animal, strip them of all their human dignity. This wasn't weird or gross or wrong. It was normal. And the sad part is that we're really not out of the woods here in America. We've continued to see discrimination and hate as a societal norm in our country. In India, there was a practice with a millennium history behind it that really peaked during the 15th and 18th centuries. It's called sati. And it was considered noble that a widow surviving their husband was to lie on the funeral pile as their husband's body burned, killing them as well. You know, many widows, especially those who didn't have any children that could support them, were pressured into this tradition. So during these 300 years, the 15th and 18th centuries, as many as 1,000 widows were burned alive per year. It was a social norm. And of course, we could bring out the Nazi example of an entire nation that condoned horrible acts and ideologies that resulted in genocide. A new study came out by Washington's Holocaust Memorial Museum with new estimates on the number of people killed during the Holocaust. And it stated that anywhere between 15 and 20 million people were killed under the Nazi regime. And the insane thing is that it just takes a few looks at the crowds gathered at Nazi rallies to see that those who were in power actually had tremendous social support. Let's take a look at China. From the 16th century to the 20th century, foot binding was an incredibly painful practice that involved wrapping little girls' feet to stunt their growth. And as we're talking about social norms, in the 19th century, nearly 100% of upper-class women and 40 to 50% of total women had their feet bound. We talk about a social norm. And it's really not in the past either. You know, one of our modern day socially acceptable human rights violations is the current practice in South Asia of child marriage. So child marriage is marrying off children under 18, and it's usually girls to older men. And in a study done in South Asian cultures, said that 45% of women aged 20 to 24 said that they were married under the age of 18. They were a victim of child marriage. And this is just the short survey of socially acceptable moral failures. For each category of oppressed people, we could have had an entire presentation. We could talk about how socially acceptable it was to strip women, children, and minorities of human rights for centuries across every nation and culture. So the truth is, societies have gotten it just as wrong as individuals, if not more so. So if we backtrack to our original definition, that society determines morality and nothing else, there's no way to say that any of these cultures is wrong. The foot binding, the widow burning, the slavery. The ultimate authority is the society, and the society told people that these actions were okay. And before we look at the flip side of this argument, we have another poll. This one will be a little bit confusing what the point of it is, but it'll become clear in a second. So we're going to open it up. This one's going to be a word cloud. So go ahead and text your responses in. Who is your most favorite social reformer? Who do you think was the most impactful? And we'll go ahead and wait for your responses here for about a minute. ahead and close that up. Yeah, so we have some interesting answers in here. We've got Elon Musk in there. Looks like MLK is the most popular one. I got Abraham Lincoln and Jesus not far behind. So what was the point of that? So it's because if society-based morality means that these socially acceptable practices were correct, it says something about the men and the women who were speaking out against them. It says that because they did not practice what was socially acceptable, they were immoral. So a lot of these faces here, there are faces that we saw in the word cloud as well. These are heroes in the fight against slavery, the abolitionist and the civil rights movement. MLK, Abraham Lincoln, Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, and Malcolm X. And each of these individuals, they fought against what was socially acceptable. But by the framework of this morality, we'd have to say that each one of these men and women were immoral, that they did not agree with society's perception of race and civil rights, and they even acted out on it. And for that, they paid dearly. They were slandered, they were abused, sometimes physically, and some of them even died for what they believed in. So if we adopted this view, we would be able to condemn individual moral failures like the Ted Bundys of the world and those headlines. But we'd also have to accept these two terrible things as well, that socially acceptable crimes would be moral and that social reformers would be immoral. And so what we see is that we need something outside of culture and societies to measure morality. Our measuring stick when we look at the individual, and even when we look at society, is adequate. We need something by which we can judge whole societies. We need something that is true regardless of where you live and at what time. And that brings us to objective morality, which Michael is going to deal with in a little bit more detail.
Aha, I smell another definition. Objective morality is the idea that good and evil are not up for interpretation. They are universal regardless of time, culture, or person. Objective morality is the only view of morality by which you can make judgments about the actions of an individual or society because you're standing on something outside of either. It is the only view that makes sense of all the examples that we've thrown out today, from Ted Bundy, to the headlines in the news, to the horrible societal atrocities committed over the years. So if this morality satisfies the conditions we have explored so far, where could this objective morality come from? Well, when we look at the category of something more, nature is perhaps the most natural answer, no pun intended. Because if humans, individuals, or societies do not determine morality, then morality must come from something in the everywhere else, in nature. This idea is particularly appealing because we have a tool that deals with truth in nature very well, the philosophy of science. In fact, famous atheists and scientists who recognize the dangers of relativism, such as Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, usually hold this view. But there are two major issues. Firstly, the philosophy of science is founded upon the values of rigorous empirical observation and experimentation. Let's keep in mind that it remains inconclusive towards anything that is not logically flawless. But as Protagoras and the Greek skeptics empirically observed thousands of years ago, and as scientists even concede today, the property of good and evil is not physically observable. This means, practically speaking, the philosophy of science remains inconclusive towards what constitutes good and evil. Effectively, this renders any conversation about good and evil not much more than pointless conjecture, like solving a detective case without any clues. Furthermore, the only evidence we have for morality arising from nature are our primate relatives who are capable of loving their tribes but have no problem with massacring outsiders, which really isn't much like our morality at all. There really isn't any good evidence to think that morality came from nature at all. In fact, even the aforementioned atheist scientist Richard Dawkins admits, and I quote, "What's to prevent us from saying Hitler wasn't right? I mean, that's a genuinely difficult question," end quote. Again, science does very little to explain morality. For the second and probably more important point, I'll use another analogy. Think about your appendix. Experts theorize it evolved to digest raw meat, but after thousands of years of us having fire, it became small and irrelevant. Oh, except when it becomes infected and annoying, and we decide to remove it. If our moral conscience is simply a thing of nature, why should it have any authority in our lives? It might help me feel good about myself if I beat my friend in chess fair and square. But if I'm taking an unproctored Zoom midterm, what's stopping me from deciding that my moral conscience is just a hindrance to the grade that I desire? Who's to say it's more important than my natural selfish desire to cheat? Why shouldn't I just remove it? In fact, this is precisely what an adulterous man thinks before he cheats on his wife. If he knows he can get away with it, he can rationalize to himself that his wife will never be hurt, and any semblance of guilt that he feels is really just in the way of his desires. Morality from nature just doesn't cut it, not in evidence, practicality, or in its alignment with the morality that we know in our hearts. But if morality is neither dependent on man nor nature, then where could it possibly come from?
So here we add another layer to our onion. If nature is insufficient to explain morality, another something else. So in this talk, we're not going to take an exhaustive approach for all the reasonings that people offer outside of nature. Our goal today was to pose the idea that we may have to look outside of ourselves, of our cultures, and even nature to understand robust morality. And all the different religions and spiritual lives take a little bit of a different approach to explain morality. But being Christian, we wanted to talk a little bit about one possible explanation for this that both Michael and I found to be true after some serious investigation. And the best place to look for the Christian worldview, of course, is the Bible, Romans 2:15. The Bible states that each one of us have this moral law. The work of the law is written on our hearts. One that is twisted and obscured in all of us maybe, but it is there nonetheless. It says that God is a God of love, of justice, of all things good, and that he made man in his image to be able to recognize and appreciate each one of those things. But the flip side of that, and the large part of our discussion today, is that we know how to recognize evil in the news headlines, in our world, even in ourselves. And the Christian explanation is that that's from God. C.S. Lewis once said that, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it, I see everything else." So I found that the Christian God casts a unique light on our world and explains so much of what is going on in our own hearts when we are outraged at the evil that is going on in this world. And so I adjure you, he really is the sun that allows us to see why we have this morality etched upon each one of our hearts. And so that's all we have for you tonight. I hope that tonight you're able to see that objective absolute morality has a really strong case. And that would, in a sense, make you wonder where it could have come from. And so with that, I'll pass it off to Godwin for some announcements.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that, Nathan and Michael. Hopefully that talk left all of you with some food for thought. And if you have any questions or things that you just want clarified from the talk, feel free to shoot us an email at berkeleyclasis@gmail.com. And Nathan and Michael will reach out to you with their answers. Or if you just want to revisit this talk or other past talks, you can also find it on our Klesis Berkeley YouTube channel. And before we go, I just have a couple of other announcements. So for next week, we're actually going to take a pause on our Klesis Weekly series because of another exciting event called Transformed. So this is going to be a 3-part event over the span of 3 days, where seniors from our group Klesis will talk about how the Christian message has led to a transformed world, transformed pursuit, and also transformed stories. So if you've ever asked questions like, how do we make sense of all the suffering in our world today? Or what leads to true happiness? Be sure to tune in at 8 p.m. next Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And another event that we wanted to let you know about is our weekly Sunday worship service. So if you're here as a Christian looking for a church, or you're interested more in the specific content of the Christian faith, we want to invite you to join us as we worship together and hear from the Word of God together. We'll be starting a new message series this week called More Than a Story, where we'll go through the various parables and teachings of Jesus. Now, if you don't remember all of that information, don't worry. You can always visit berkeley.klesis.org or our Facebook and Instagram pages for our latest events and to connect with us. I will include all of that information in the chat. So yeah, with that, that's all I have for today. Once again, we're really glad that all of you guys could join us. Stay healthy, stay safe. We hope to see you all at the Transform events next week. Bye.